I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Louise to do this final short paper talk. Louise was my first ever contact with SRF when she ran reviews. So if you haven't had it, if you're not a member, we do a small journal, and Louise used to run it. So Louise was my first ever contact. But we've got a talk on Plato and the animals. What is the purpose of philosophy in an age of an environmental crisis? I'll give you a wave when you've got 5 minutes.
Okay,
left.
That sounds good. All right, thank you very much, Finley. So I'm not doing a PowerPoint. I thought I'd go a bit old school, so you can treat it like a podcast or something. just listen. So it is a bit of an understatement, I think, to say that Plato has had a very bad press, particularly in recent decades. David Clough, for example, he assumes a fairly neat distinction between the Christian and Platonic traditions, arguing that we must refuse, he says, to accept the Neoplatonic hierarchies of value that have been influential on Christian theology. And Mark Wallace, in his When God Was a Bird, he's another more recent example of this. Christianity, as Wallace sees it, became a vassal to the dualistic hierarchies of Plato and Aristotle, who saw what is animal and mineral as soulless, starkly divided from human beings. The language of Babylonian captivity is used by Wallace to describe the plight in which Christianity is held on account of its philosophical categories and divisions. And this is something he calls a Neoplatonic cul-de-sac, in which world is dead, fallen matter from which human souls must escape. Now, it's not my intention today to disagree with the problems of dualistic systems, but my concern is that this story isn't quite right. And I think the blame game, as it often runs, has the risk of reinforcing the priority of abstract thinking and eclipsing some of the really important things we need to consider if we are to stand any chance of finding a better way to live in the world. So in this paper, I will draw attention to some of the elements of the Platonic corpus that are often overlooked, particularly animals and the use of myth. And through doing this, I hope to suggest that Plato's philosophy is a useful point of reflection to think about the role of the political and the economic in our relationship with non-human animals. The Platonic corpus is full of references to animals, and many of Plato's myths blur the boundary between human and non-human animal. And I've only got time to talk about one myth today, so I will focus on the myth of the statesman, a dialogue that seeks to discover what makes a good politician. And Julia Annas calls this dialogue, she says it does come across as boring and weird. So I think that's why it's not often read or discussed. In The Statesman, the character Socrates the Younger converses with the Eleatic stranger, a foreigner from Elea. And together they discuss the art of statecraft. It's like herding, they propose. And a discussion ensues as to what they are herding, and it proceeds by the process of division. And obviously, you probably already know that the method of collection and division is a central component of Plato's method of dialectic. The younger Socrates, in The Statesman, thinks we can divide the care of human beings from the care of the beasts. The stranger, however, thinks that this is an error. We cannot assume that all species can be lumped together under the class of beasts and separated from the humans. If there is any other animal capable of thought, such as a bird like the crane appears to be, that animal, the stranger says, would probably divide cranes from non-cranes and then call all the non-cranes beasts. Instead, a closer look suggests that humans should be categorised with bipeds. And then a further division of the biped class is needed into featherless and non-featherless. So statecraft is therefore defined as the art of herding human beings who are defined as those two-legged walking animals that don't have horns and are featherless. Hence the story that the philosopher Diogenes stormed into Plato's academy holding a plucked chicken saying, "Behold Plato's man." And that became a meme in about 2010. So if you Google Plato's animal, man, you get all sorts of weird and wonderful things anyway. So this, in the dialogue so far, this doesn't really give an adequate understanding of political leadership. So the stranger says that the search for a good politician must begin again from a new starting point and travel by a different road. And this different path is the telling of a so-called famous story. And this is the mythical tale of the age of Chronos. It is a story of reverse evolution, with the universe oscillating like a pendulum. At certain periods, it has its present motion, and at other periods, it revolves in the reverse direction, turning back on itself. And the age of Chronos, we're told, was a previous period of revolution and a much happier age. The fruits of the earth, it said, sprang up of their own accord, and humans grew younger instead of older. We are told that God supervised the universe as a whole, and the deities shepherded the various regions. It was a pacifist age. No creature was wild, nor did they eat one another, nor was there war or strife. Significantly, humans conversed with the animals, and this wasn't just general chit-chat, but it was conversation with a view to philosophy. And it's said that humans learned from every creature, all the while increasing their wisdom. And in this age, as David Krell puts it, all of our possibilities, both human and non-human animal, were, he says, held in common, which befits a community of friends. We're told in this myth that the humans were wiser and happier because they learned from the animals and because they shared their leisure. Moreover, humans and animals together constituted the polis, the political state. Eventually, according to this myth, the divine helmsman of the universe dropped the tiller and withdrew, and the universe turned back, meaning that humans had to direct their own lives, taking care of themselves. Humans at this point stopped learning philosophy from the animals and had to get by through unreliable memory, remembering only dimly the care of the gods. And eventually humans became forgetful. And this, we are told, is our current age. Moreover, this current forgetful anthropological age that requires politics, statecraft and agriculture, this anthropological age requires politics, statecraft and agriculture, because all of these were unnecessary in the age of Chronos. So it's a strange vision, it is weird. So what are we meant to make of it? We're clearly not meant to take it literally, but it is very significant within the dialogue. And Plato says of his myths elsewhere that we should believe something like it. The myth interweaves politics, theology, and ecology. And more specifically, the art of good stateship consists of practicing a politics of care. In the statesman, the current age of disharmony is a direct result of us forgetting to care for the animals and forgetting how to philosophize with them. And another thing to note is that the statesman unsettles the human-animal dichotomy. Just before the myth, we're told that herding allows the dividing of living things into tame and wild, but this division is ethical in nature. Human wildness does not equate to animality. Instead, human tameness and wildness are different ways of relating to ourselves and to others. So the most basic ontological distinction that can be made here is ethical. It's between humans and animals who care and the humans and animals who do not. After the myth, when the discussion goes back to the subject of what makes a good politician, we're told that politicians take charge of living beings not singly as individuals, but in common. The art of statecraft, we're told, is the art of weaving the different aspects of a political community together. And although it's acknowledged that we're not living in the age of Chronos now, the stranger proposes that the myth helps us to see the ideal divine ruler more clearly. The ruler is one who weaves together the needs of both human and non-human, presenting a vision of the common good of all living beings. So in the statesman, politics becomes an essential part of ecological care. So I'll say something just now about the interrelationship between myth and philosophy. So Plato writes in a historical context of the emergence of philosophy as promoted by the pre-Socratic philosophers. And in this context, poetic and mythological discourse is regarded as standing in opposition to philosophy. And with Plato, though, we see the refusal to accept convention as authoritative. So he refuses to accept the authority of the poetic texts of Homer and Hesiod. But Plato does not reject mythos. He doesn't follow the pre-Socratics, enforcing a binary choice between myth and dialectical philosophy. Instead, myths saturate the Platonic corpus, and Socrates himself is presented as the master myth maker. So the Platonic dialogues as a whole are often dialectical in form. However, they are presented in story form because they're presented as dialogues. And the myths are often double-edged. Socrates tells us that myths are for enchantment, but he says we must charm ourselves to seek a life of wisdom and virtues. These stories, he says, cast spells. So myths are what enchants us. And these myths are also double-edged, so the enchantment can be for good or it can be for ill. In the hands of Socrates, myths spark questions and they encourage learning. In the hands of the poets and the sophists as well, they're orientated towards control. In the statesman, then, I suggest that we're pointed towards the instability of language when we talk or think about human and the animal in the myth of Cronos. This binary is actually problematized. And as Catherine Morgan puts it, myth in philosophy does not represent irrationality as such, but a system of discourse in which language is not an adequate expression of reality. With Plato's mythical animals, then, we're saved from dogmatism and certainty because we're made more aware of the limits of language. In the statesman, as in many other Platonic myths, a vision is presented of things imagined otherwise. In the age of Cronos, we're told, there is no need for politics because of the abundance of seed-bearing plants. But once the universe turns on itself to the present age, politics comes into being. The myth then reminds us of the centrality of politics in considering the human relationship with the wider world. Another element of the vision of the age of Cronos is the contrast between abundance on the one hand and scarcity on the other. It's not just politics that comes into being with scarcity, but also economics. Because in an age of abundance, there is no need to economize. The city-state is born because the role of the city is to guard its members against scarcity. And William J. Booth has done quite a lot to emphasise the importance of economics for the ancient Greek thinkers, which is often overlooked. And he makes a good case, I think, that the idea of scarcity was central to the ancient Greek view of the human condition. Booth highlights the prevalence of myths in ancient Greece that contrasted the current age of scarcity with a golden age of abundance. And the most famous myth of this, which many of you will be familiar with, is the myth of Pandora's box or jar. And Hesiod reports this myth and says that Pandora's jar released many evils, including the evil of poverty. And the statesman could be seen as just another fanciful tale like Pandora's jar to explain the reality of scarcity and need. However, unlike Hesiod, Socrates makes it obvious that we're not meant to take his tale as literal. The myth of Cronos is instead the imagining of a different possibility. I think reminding us that scarcity itself has a mythical function in the present age through its ability to alter and often restrict our ethical choices. And to understand this more fully, we can turn to another Platonic animal-themed exercise in imagination, which is in the Republic and its city of sows or pigs. And the city of pigs is Socrates' ideal city in the Republic. But it's worth pausing to note that actually this is not the famous tripartite ideal city of guardians, auxiliaries, and workers, because that city is not actually the ideal city at all. The real ideal city is the city of pigs as imagined through the method of dialectic, which happens very early on in the dialogue in answer to that central question, what is justice? And the answer to that question, what is justice, is worked out through a consideration of human need. What kind of city would we have if we think according to human need? And the real ideal city is described as a small community of people who support each other as associates and helpers. Things are held in common. They are shared and exchanged when needed. People make only what they need, but they don't have a hard existence. Instead, we're told that they eat sumptuously, including excellent barley cakes and bread. People lie on straw beds strewn with oak and myrtle. They drink wine and live in harmony with each other, taking care to avoid hunger and war. They live to a ripe old age and then pass on their successors a life just like this one. So it's a fully sustainable ideal city. It's also a vegetarian city, and this detail is crucial because it prompts an outraged interjection from the character Glaucon, who rejects this small city with one of the worst engendered possible insults at the time because he calls it a city of pigs. Glaucon balks at vegetarian or any life without the trimmings that he's used to. He demands that people should recline on couches, have paintings, embroideries and home furnishings. They should eat off tables, consuming all the foods he's used to, including desserts, and this is my favourite translation from the Greek in the Lurb. They should have each and every kind of pastry. And Socrates is consequently pushed by this demand for luxury into imagining what the best possible city might look like in those circumstances of luxury. And all the while he's reluctant to do this, he says that that luxury city will be inflamed and feverish. It will be unlike the true and healthy state that's first been proposed. And the result is a city that's marked by excess but also scarcity. And the animals in that luxury city do not fare well because the state has to become bigger and bigger to accommodate the luxuries that are demanded with servants, gold, ivory. Animals are then needed in very large numbers to provide this luxurious food for the ballooning population. And then there'll be a lack of space for these animals. So therefore the city will have to go and take space from its neighbours, which will start war. And that's when we get the first mention of those philosopher guardians, because they result from the demand for from the demand for increasing luxury and that resultant need for security from scarcity. So hunger, war, intensive farming, and hegemony therefore come into being through that demand for luxury. So I think what we've got here is the city of pigs in the age of Kronos actually functioning as another possibility of existence, which is better than our current age. And that imaginative vision keeps that city in our mind's eye, if you like. And I think it reminds us perhaps that scarcity itself is a mythos rather than an existential fact about the cosmos. And I think we're reminded how adopting either a mythos of scarcity or one of abundance has an enormous impact on shaping the ethical life and shaping the choices that we make. So this is well understood by Aristotle, that poverty and toil limit and shape the choices, freedoms and possibilities that we have. And the statesman, I think, recognises that that mythos of scarcity will just pervade our lives, shape our politics and impact on our ability to seek virtue. So I'll bring in Iris Murdoch here, another Platonist, who says that when we arrive at a moment of ethical choice, what we think is a moment of ethical choice, then actually that choice has already been made for us. We're very restricted in the things that are open to us. So I think this could be perhaps appreciated more fully. So David Clough, for example, does acknowledge economics as a barrier to change. He says it would be very expensive to transition to a reality in which non-humans are recognised as having moral status, and he says, we shouldn't exaggerate the costs of, say, switching to a vegetarian diet. But I think there's much more potential here, I think, to draw attention to some of the systemic ways in which economics affects our moral choices. And Stephen McMullen has done some recent work which I think is helpful here, because he's highlighted the split that's developed between ethics and economics, that economists have been very keen to expel ethical arguments because they see what they do as sort of scientific, which is based on empirical evidence and devoid of the need for ethics. And what that's meant is that economics tends to assume that many ethical questions, like those pertaining to animal ethics, are actually personal matters rather than questions of justice. And economics then tends to embrace the kind of utilitarianism. So we assume that individual preferences count for everything, when in fact what happens is there are systemic constraints that limit the expression of some preferences and encourage others. So scarcity, I think, often forces people into a kind of a top trumps utilitarianism, and often in that situation the animals do not fare well because they're not really regarded, their interests are just not regarded as being as important as human interests. So I think our current economic systems and its inherent anthropocentrism actually impact on how we imagine the expense that David Clough talks about. So I think I see here an emphasis on actually trying to bring the ethics back into economics. And I think there's a desperate need to reform our economics, and we cannot do this without consideration of the good life. And I'll just throw in some things that McMullen talks about, because he says we should think about who we recognise in law, the use of government subsidies and taxes, the use of competition, a regulation, all of those things which tend to mitigate the impulse to prioritise profitability over and above the flourishing of non-human life. So our current system is kind of shoving us into certain means of production, and that then tends to limit consumer choice. It systematically disadvantages certain groups, including non-human animals. So I'll just give a quick conclusion, really, just to summarise. I've tried to challenge that received view of Plato, and I've tried to kind of highlight how I think considerations of politics and economics cannot be separated quite so cleanly from our consideration of non-human animals. And I think some challenge to the binary thinking is perhaps necessary to get there. I think that's 20 minutes. I saw you waving at me, Finley, so I better stop.
Thank you very much. So, questions?
At the beginning, when you explained that there was a good relation between man and animals, and that men were learning from animals, it was kind of a peaceful thing, and then something that stopped. It made me thinking about in the Bible, the situation after the fall.
Yeah.
So is there any link there, or because it was written 400 before Christ?
Yes.
Is there any connection?
Myths of some sort of golden age, very similar to the Garden of Eden, were very, very common at that time. So I don't know, I'd have to bring in a biblical scholar and do some more work in that, because it's something that struck me that I haven't fully explored yet, but I think there was such a general prevalence of those kinds of myths. And a lot of thought then with the pre-Socratics and with Socrates, Plato, we see, I think, the start of consideration of what do we do with those myths? Like what do we mean? How are we supposed to use those myths? The pre-Socratics wanted to throw them all out in place of philosophy as a kind of pure discipline. And the kind of mythical tradition just took those myths as being authoritative. And I think what Plato's doing is trying to kind of rethink, or how do you hold that together? Because it's like interpretations of that kind of Genesis myth. What does it mean for us? How can we talk about that meaning with our own limited language? So I think there are connections, and it's just really interesting that you do get a lot of myths like that, especially of this kind of age of abundance where everyone's happy.
That was so interesting, and I really liked how you articulated your stories. I really enjoyed that, so thank you. So this is once again just a kind of train of thought, and maybe it will end in a question. I am not sure.
Okay.
Because you're saying, so this idea of scarcity versus abundance has been something that has been on my mind a lot lately, because I think we are taught this, in fact, you call it kind of a myth of scarcity, and I really like that, because I think we are taught that there isn't enough to go around, but then at the same time we see there is a lot of excess. And I think there is something there to show that it might not be that there is not enough to go around, it's just that it's not distributed in a way that is fair. And that relates also to the myths that you were talking about, you know, how if you have a life of lots of luxury, then it kind of ends in a lot of other problems. So yeah, that's I guess it's more something to say when people say, oh, but the vegan diet or vegetarian diet is more expensive, or things like this. It's like, actually, yeah, it's more about the process of how everything is set up to be wasteful in the end. And this kind of relates also to the economy and how things are made for, how did you say it? So you prioritize, it was Macmillan, I think.
Yeah, the profitability and...
So you prioritize profitability over flourishing of individuals, and this is like this systematically disadvantages some individuals. And so you also talked about reforming this idea of economics, and I just want to also point out that economy actually, so I think it comes from a Greek word called oikonomia, and it's actually management of the household. And so this economics has evolved from something that was just like you were just managing your own household into this whole systematic oppression, actually, of some people over others. So it turns out I don't have a question.
I think that's really helpful, actually, because that it does capture quite a lot of what I was thinking about. That I think the dialogues, they do emphasise that the abundant scarcity, it's not necessarily a statement of fact. It is a narrative, it's a story, it's a kind of mythos, if you like, in the ancient Greek way of thinking, which then kind of, when you see it like that, kind of shifts the attention elsewhere onto those systems. And the idea of the household, I think it's really significant. So I think William J. Booth's work is fascinating, because he does actually take some of that received view of the ancient Greek approach to economics very differently, because he says that actually, I like Hannah Arendt, a lot of her work, but he does say that she's actually shifted quite a lot. So we don't really tend to see the ancient Greeks as thinking about economics in the same sort of broader way. We just tend to see them as focusing on the household. But actually, I think within that in Aristotle and Plato, there is a kind of, they appreciate the bleeding of the household economics into that wider thing. And Aristotle certainly was very concerned about how some of those structures in ancient Greece, those economic structures, actually did cause that system of hegemony. So he was reflecting on democracy as well, as linked to economics, because if you want people to contribute to the polis, they have to have some spare time, because they've got to engage in debate and mug up on stuff. And then in an age of scarcity, when people are toiling more and more and more, how do you then create that spare time to do that? Well, then you need your household. So you delegate those tasks to your household, and the head of the household, you have your slaves or whatever it is, and your animals are part of that. So you then create that hierarchical system. So it's like democracy as well as economics. It's all kind of wrapped up with questions of, like, what do we do with that then? We like democracy, but actually, it does tend to rest on some sort of a hierarchy.
Thank you so much for that. That was really interesting. I learned more about Plato. I had a question or concern. I wonder if you feel like Plato would have had an answer for this, or if you have some insight into this, where for me, the image of this harmonistic society is actually a little bit terrifying. The idea of like, oh, you kind of have the society, everything clicks really well, and then you pass it on to the next generation. That thing sort of perpetuates, maybe forever without change. Really, kind of rides against just my sensibilities, but also, moreover, I'm thinking about Popper's interpretation of Plato and also Slavoj Žižek's interpretation of Plato, where those two disagree about a lot of how they see Plato, but I think both agreed that the sort of Platonic image of harmony actually was really useful as a propaganda tool for, very, very dangerous political forces in the 1930s and 40s.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on this image of harmony and its potential problems, and how would you address those sorts of issues?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, thank you. I think I would emphasise that kind of double-edged nature, which I think is being considered throughout a lot of the Platonic dialogues. And I think it's there, for example, in the Phaedrus, where there's the discussion of writing, and it's like the pharmakon, famous pharmakon word is used, like that this is, it could either be a poison or a remedy. So I think, yes, that's true of writing, but actually it's there throughout the Platonic dialogues. It's referred to a lot of things, and I think it's perhaps true of this harmony. So everything actually becomes either a medicine or a poison. So sophistry could be both, myths can be both, and I think that hierarchy could also be, but that harmony could act well or it could act for ill. And then you get into that discussion, well, how do you know the difference then? And I think this is where actually you have to go to the collective. So the Platonic dialogues are dialogues. They're used like people together as a collective working this out. And I think perhaps we actually have within Plato a warning that actually those powers often do try to reassert themselves. And it's like you have to be on the watch all the time, because the kind of the ideal state in the luxury world is one where you have a democratically engaged, if you like, because I see the ideal city as actually being a model for the human soul, where you are continually thinking and reflecting, and your population are engaged, they are educated, so education becomes the remedy for the luxury city in the Republic. You have to educate people, and everybody has to philosophize, as in seek wisdom. So I think, if you have that kind of authoritarian use of that myth to suppress, then that's actually against what Plato's doing. But I think he is perhaps drawing attention to that double-edged problem.
Unfortunately, you're gonna have to ask Louise to take a break, because we are at time. But I just want to say thank you ever so much.
Thank you. It's been great
Louise,
to
another
meet you.
round of applause.